Welcome to the TheoTherapist Podcast, where theologically trained licensed therapists share health and healing conversations. Join our host, Dr. Trice for conversations about real-life issues from both theological and therapeutic perspectives.
Welcome to the Season 3, Episode 2 of the TheoTherapist Podcast. I am Dr. Trice Glenn, your host, and I'm so glad that you're joining us today. Today's episode is one that I have been waiting for. It talks about something that's near and dear to my heart and my own research. But first, let me tell you who our guest is today. Today, we have Reverend Lessie Johnson, who is a licensed master social worker, but also a dynamic scholar and speaker and advocate for healing and transformation. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's in social work. She also has a master's of divinity from Emory's Candler School of Theology. Okay, that's double master. She's almost going to catch up with me in a minute. And, we'll see what she does for her doctorate. Hint, hint, hint. She has a passion for bridging faith and healing and mental health, and she's done some research on it. She has one of the most unique research projects I think I've ever heard. Her theological honors thesis is on Glam Theology, a journey through complicated grief and trauma. And so I can't wait to hear more about that from her today. We're so glad you're joining us. Today's topic for our podcast is faith, resilience, and healing from trauma. This topic is so close and near and dear to my heart because it is very closely knitted with the goal of the TheoTherapist Podcast, which is to have real talk at the intersection of theology and therapy. And so often that real talk has to do with us navigating adversity. And resilience is about navigating adversity. And we look at it from the perspective of how does our faith interact with that journey? And so we're going to look at that complicated intersection today of spiritual coping, theological conflict, and healing from some traumatic events in your life. If you've listened to our other podcasts, you recognize that we have a guiding question for each of our podcasts. The guiding question today is, how does my faith help me to cope and heal from trauma? And so welcome, Reverend Lessie. Glad you're here today. I'm going to start off just by saying, what got you interested in kind of the intersection of, therapy and theology?
It started with basically when as I was doing my, I guess you want to say like real big girl jobs as a social worker, I couldn't override the fact that I was still very much so passionate about business, doing makeup, fashion, all of that stuff. And so it started with me branching out and creating like my own business structure, but also still working as a social worker. And what I learned is when I function in both roles, I was still talking a lot about my faith. As a social worker, in any capacity, I still was talking to my clients about faith. We would have those conversations, and I noticed that even with doing makeup, a lot of people didn't have that understanding for me that there is a sweet spot for, counseling, mental health, and also spirituality and faith. And so when I realized that I became more interested in, how do I, do social work but do it a spiritual lens, or how do I do spirituality but do a social work lens, or how do I help the two speak for one another? And so that's pretty much how I got started and what led me down the path of doing my MDiv.
I so much resonate with that because it's really hard, even if you have a mental health background and you've been taught, to keep these clear boundary lines between faith and mental health. But when your clients are seeking, meaning making, and they're trying to hold on to something, and the typical CBT coping strategies aren't enough for them, and you can find that there's a resonant space of spirituality and faith, we just have to share what we have. We have to share who we are in those spaces. And I think it makes a big difference for those we come in contact with.
It definitely does. And I think what also drove my passion was the fact that there wasn't a lot of conversation about it, especially amongst like my colleagues, or there would be things said, like you said, like keep the main thing, as they say. And so if you're here to do social work, do social work. Don't talk about spirituality, don't talk about faith. If the client brings it up, direct their attention somewhere else. And for me, I just couldn't do that because I felt like there's a space for spirituality in mental health, to any capacity. And so yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that for me was like the driving force. Like, no one can tell me just based off of my life experience. I know that my faith is what allowed me to get here in the first place. And so that's really what drove me into seeking out, how do I find that sweet spot for, the intersection for these two.
And this particular intersection, like I mentioned, is so close to me and my own research. My dissertation focused on looking at spiritual identity development and where that intersects with resilience, particularly for those who had childhood trauma experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at young adults and said, wow, so how did you, quote unquote, become resilient and make it to
Mm-hmm.
this point? And how did your spirituality or your concept of spirituality influence that at all? And I found some very interesting things. One of the things that I think that theology and pastoral counseling or theotherapy bring to this particular topic is meaning making. There is
Mm-hmm.
something that comes out of the theological realm that helps us put some meaning to some of the experiences we have. And when we
Mm-hmm.
can identify some meaning to that, it can help us cope with it, I think, in a
Mm-hmm.
different way. And so
Absolutely.
you've probably seen this in your experience too, is that somehow people have to use some type of language to help them navigate through the
Mm-hmm.
trauma, whether it was
Mm-hmm.
sin and devil, or if it was, God's grace and, purpose. Like, there's
Mm-hmm.
language that sometimes helps people, navigate that kind of bridge over troubled waters.
Yeah, because I feel like we're a human, and so naturally, as humans, we want to, like you said, that meaning making part becomes very significant for anything that occurs, because we have to make connections, have to know, okay, why did this happen, or why am I going here, or why did I end up here? And so I think that absolutely that whole theological space with resiliency, there's a connection, because a lot of the information that comes from the theological understanding is what creates one's ability to be resilient in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding that, this happened, but, there's grace within this situation, or, that there is an answer from God that can keep me to be motivated and keep me moving. So I absolutely agree and resonate with that.
One of the things I said, I did an article called Bridge Over Troubled Water. And one of the things I said about resilience is that it is one's capacity and ability to adapt in positive manifestations following adversity and environmental stressors. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
it's like having a sense of purposeful living, and that being the trait that you need to get beyond whatever has happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that positive manifestation is what happens that makes it
Yeah.
resilience, right? Because there's
Yeah.
lots of ways to cope. We
Mm-hmm.
encounter people who cope, with substances, and people who cope with
Mm-hmm.
lashing out and,
Mm-hmm.
kind of leaning into emotions like anger.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are other ways to cope that might have more of a positive outcome or consequences in your life.
Right. Absolutely.
I'm curious for you, when you started looking at kind of the intersection of theology and therapy, particularly around this topic, what stood out to you?
Which topic? Resiliency or
Resiliency, healing from trauma.
what stood out for me was the whole understanding of the Imago Day.
Mhm.
Um, and so for me, just looking at a lot of the social work, psychology, theoretical frameworks, cognitive behavioral, all of that stuff. When I looked at the Imago Day, being that I'm made in the image of God, the connection was, if I'm made in the image of this all powerful, all knowing, this amazing God, when life starts life and I have to find healthy coping strategies to take care of myself because, as far as like you said, there are some, people cope in all different kind of ways. But for me, knowing that, addiction runs in my family, alcoholism runs in my family, and knowing that, okay, I already have anxiety and I already have depression. And so these
Mm-hmm.
are things that I know that I can't run towards, right? Because it's not going to work in my favor, regardless of whether it was a trait in my family or not. But if I'm made in the image of the God, and the word is telling me that I'm made in the image of God, then I have to find a healthy way to take care of myself and do it in a way that's authentic to me. And
Mm-hmm.
so that for me is what really stood out, is that, whether it's beautifying myself, adorning myself in any type of way, that because I'm made in the image of God, I have to find a way to take care of myself. Because I'm made in the image of God, when life gets to be the worst times, that I have to make sure that I get up and keep moving because the things that I've learned about God resonate with me. I'm just a reflection of who God is. And so that
Mm-hmm.
was what not only helped me cope through a lot of different things, but actually helped to keep me moving and help keep me, going deeper into understanding what does it truly mean to be made in the image of God, and how do I use my faith to connect to this understanding, and how do I use this and talk to other people and encourage other people about it, because a lot of times, things can happen in life and then it's like, well, I'm not getting out of bed for days or whatever the case may be. And so that for me was something that I really began to explore and really stuck out for me.
One of the things I think that's unique about this intersection is that, kind of going a little bit back to the language, we have language in theology that talks about suffering and lamenting,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like acknowledging and fully being present with the fact that something has happened, something traumatic has
Mm-hmm.
happened, and not glossing over it, not being in denial, recognizing that it is unfortunately a part of human existence, is that we face
Mm-hmm.
some things sometimes that are just, they feel unbearable, or they feel unfair, they feel
Mm-hmm.
unnecessary, but there's still language that helps us go, okay, even if I'm in a season of suffering, even if I am lamenting because something I have lost or I'm grieving something, it is a season. There is
Mm-hmm.
some sense that this too will end, this will pass, and I'll have a new
Mm-hmm.
space. And I kind of feel like that's where our faith does influence resilience, because if we
Mm-hmm.
have some pathways forward, it says then I don't have to just rely on myself to get through this. There's
Mm-hmm.
like a whole host of folks that have come before me, and this is how they've
Mm-hmm.
navigated through things, and this is what they called it, and this is how they got
Mm-hmm.
over it.
Absolutely. And it also too, I feel like I think it also reinforces that you're not doing this life thing by yourself. A lot of times we try to do things in our own strength, or we think that, you know, um, I have to journal, but journal is not helping me. And I have to see a therapist, but that's not helping me. But I think that for me, when you find the connection that, okay, I'm journaling, but I'm also, building my faith and my connection with God. I'm going to therapy, but I'm also continuing to be in those compassionate spaces, whether it's at the women's meeting, when you're around people who are also um, faith minded, or have an understanding of their faith and how it can empower them. You understand that even though this is a season and it's rough and it's dark, that my faith is my guiding light, and I'm not doing this by myself. And I think that that is a pretty significant piece of being resilient, knowing that yes, life is rough, yes, the season is rough, but I'm not doing this alone, and I'm not walking through the season alone.
When you talk to people about, kind of the bouncing back or the ability of kind of, navigating trauma, what's kind of the way that you talk them through?
When I talk to people about bouncing back, basically, I use a lot of the times what I do is I use my own experiences
Mm-hmm.
because I'm a big advocate for not speaking into and on about things that you don't have that experience of. And I feel like where there's pain, there's always a purpose. And a lot of times your purpose comes through those painful experiences. And so normally when I'm speaking to other people about overcoming trauma, um, I'm speaking about my experiences, but I also use my faith, my understanding of God, my experiences of God, and also, the different things that we've learned in psychology and social work, and just that evidence-based stuff that tells us, if you do this, you can get through that. But basically just sharing my own experience, because I know for me that is what has truly gotten me through. Being able to lean heavily on God and my faith, is what has shown me, like, there is a God. The things that I've overcome and I've experienced, it wasn't just psychology, it wasn't just the therapist, it wasn't just, journaling and different things like that. It was a combination of things. And so speaking into that belief and that hope factor that yes, this is painful, and you're gonna struggle, you're gonna cry, you're gonna be frustrated, you're gonna have all of these questions, but at the end of the day, you have to have belief that there's hope on the other side of despair. And so that's usually my framework is, keep creating a pattern of, or maybe I want to say like a triangle of, there's hope, there's faith, and there's despair, and you can get around to the other side of despair. And so that's pretty much how I use that's my approach to conversations about overcoming trauma, and basically also, helping them to recognize that because I'm here having this conversation with you, that within itself is evidence, like the manifestation of God, the manifestation of what it looks like to go through and keep pushing and keep believing. Because again, had I fall victim to, my depression or that experience, we would not be having this conversation. And I think that too speaks to the hope of, the conversation that we're having, and helping people to see that, we're all going to experience life and we're all just trying our best to make it. But there are other people who have come before me who have experienced these things and can get through them.
And I think you bring up a really good point that we often have to remind people is that just because, we were called to this call, or, we go out and we serve others, with the fullness of who we are, it doesn't mean we're exempt from traumatic
Right.
experiences ourselves.
So it does
Matter
not.
of fact, most of us that come into this work do so after having navigated trauma, right?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
many are still working out their trauma, in the midst of trying to navigate kind of being caregivers for others, and called in the spaces of sitting with others in the midst of their trauma. When I think about trying to help people navigate through trauma, particularly bouncing back, and I know bouncing back kind of has some negative connotation, kind of like I'm not going backwards, I'm going forward. But I think about the fact that you can't heal from anything that you won't acknowledge, right? And that's what I tell my clients first and foremost. Like, if we can't be honest about where the pain point is, where the hurt is, where the harm happened, then we can't get to a place of healing, because we don't even have the pathway. You got to find a way to be honest about what you are navigating and figure out how to go forward. In overcoming that trauma, you may have to navigate through lots of different experiences that happened as a result of the traumatic event, right? Because trauma can be anything from a car accident to a domestic violence situation to complicated grief. It could be any situation where you've either felt psychologically in danger or physically in danger, or a threat happened to you, or something that was just so dramatic that it shook you at your core. And as a result of that, life has shifted for you, and your mental awareness has shifted in a way that you now have an after effect. And so when I talk to people, I was like, yes, you need to acknowledge what has happened to you, but you also have to look at how has that affected you since then? Has it affected
Mm-hmm.
your self-esteem? Has it affected your anxiety levels, your depression? Has it affected how you trust others? Do
Mm-hmm.
you trust your environment? Like, what are the things that we have to address first before we can get to healing? We need to know where the tentacles are, as I tell my
Mm-hmm.
clients. I need to know everything that got impacted so that we can then have an opportunity to say, hey, if I want to heal, I know that these areas need healing as well. A salve
Yeah, and
needs to go in these spaces.
I think too, also helping them to recognize that when I like bouncing back, I think a lot of people they think that that just automatically means like, oh, you get knocked down, you get back up. And while that can happen, like you said, like there's a lot that goes into dealing with what goes on at ground zero. And I think that a lot of people get afraid
Mhm.
of, being in that space of being down, and having to navigate, okay, what is actually going on. But I
Mhm.
like to also remind people that that is that ground zero space, that space where you feel like, okay, I'm at the worst, I'm at my wits end. That's where God's most profound work can be done. And
Absolutely.
what I like to also say is like, this is a time where you have to get to the core of things, because I find that a lot of times, especially in today's society, we're so quick to try to bounce back and not realizing that eventually you're going to get to a point where something's going to happen and you're going to be knocked down. And that bouncing back is not going to be the same. As they say, like, when you get up in your 40s or 50s, those knees don't work the same. And so bouncing back just becomes a lot more of a difficult task, because now you have different things on top of different things that you haven't necessarily dealt with. So I just say that to say that, yes, I do also feel like a lot of the times when you're in those spaces, you have to really pause and say, okay, what is it? What is going on? What do I need to work on? So that when I do get to the point of bouncing back, that I come back and the velocity of me bouncing back is a lot different, because I can flow through life different. I can engage with people differently, because, like you said, trauma impacts the way you engage with yourself, the world, God, everything.
Mhm.
And so I think that that's a very significant part of, that whole idea of bouncing back. And also recognizing that bouncing back doesn't have to look like everybody else is bouncing back. You don't have to
Absolutely.
bounce back at the same time frame that everyone else bounces back. So yeah.
And it's custom to you.
Mm-hmm.
Only you know what healing looks like for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Healing for you might be that you have a new lease on life, or healing for you might be, you know what? I feel freer than I felt before.
Mm-hmm.
It all depends on kind of where you are in your journey.
Right.
Sometimes on the other side of something, you have a new awareness that makes you feel more alive or more a part of your purpose. And so
Right.
you decide what that healing is. You and God work through
Mm-hmm.
what healing looks like for you.
Right.
No one else
Absolutely.
gets to prescribe that version of healing for you.
Right. Because they will try, but
Right.
mm-hmm.
Our last topic I want to cover is kind of, similar to that, is overcoming. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when you're trying to overcome those tentacles, as I call it, those leftover things like fear or self-doubt, maybe there's some imposter syndrome that you end up facing, and women tend to face that, in the workplace a lot. The question becomes, how do we navigate those to a place where we feel like healing is happening?
I think for me it takes one, like a lot of acknowledgement, acknowledging that, first and foremost, there are things that are showing up that are, that are causing my mind and my body to recognize that, hey, there's something that needs to, be healed, or something that needs to be focused on. And so for me, a lot of the, self-doubt or imposter syndrome and all of that stemmed from my trauma, those traumatic experiences that left the residue of I'm not good enough, or
Mm,
if I allow myself to actually be, if I acknowledge that I'm broken, that I need healing, or allow other people to see that, then I'm gonna be, the mask is gonna be ripped off, the wounds are gonna show. And just acknowledging that that's okay. And that, if I continue to be afraid of accepting and acknowledging and that there's a lot that needs to be focused on and a lot that needs to be healed, then I'm never actually going to heal because all I'm doing is trying to, create almost like a costume and put on a facade. And so for me, a lot of it took, or I think takes getting honest with God. I think often God has already shown us those areas that God wants us to sit and deal with. And
Mm-hmm.
we're like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that right now. Gotta get this degree, or I have to, get this promotion, or I have to get this certification. And we try to cover up those things, not realizing that no matter how far you go in life, that self-doubt, that imposter syndrome, if you don't deal with what's at the core of it, it's always going to manifest, and it's going to manifest in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say a lot of it comes from actually getting to the core of things. I think a lot of that self-doubt, imposter syndrome comes from, like we talked about, those early childhood experiences where, someone may have said something that now planted a seed of doubt that everywhere you go, or, you know, you didn't try hard enough, or you're not good enough, or, you'll never fit into those spaces. So instead of actually, taking a risk and challenge yourself for, a MDiv, you go into something different because those people have already planted that seed that you're not good enough to do it or you can't do it. And so for me, I think a lot of it focuses on dealing with, needs to be uncovered and allowing that ugly, dark space or whatever comes with it to take place. I think a lot
Mm-hmm.
of times we run from it. And for me, particularly in my own experience, I would allow enough of the process to happen, and when it got too uncomfortable, or when it got to like, okay, this is a lot, it's like, all right, God, we're done with this for now. Let's keep achieving. And it got to a point where no matter how much I achieved, no matter what, I did, I could not override the fact that I'm hurting, I'm broken, and I need to deal with this. And it wasn't until I actually allowed myself to say, okay, Leslie, if you don't deal with this at this level, it's gonna deal with you. And this time when it deals with you, you're not going to be able to bounce back. And so yeah, it took me to really like take that hard pause. And I think a lot of times like taking that pause and being honest with yourself and allowing, God to have those broken pieces and giving them over to God and saying, listen, here's my broken pieces, or here's, my dreams, my hopes, my wishes, or my experiences, or even my canvas, and I'm willing and open to allowing you to take the brush and paint as you will. And that's what I had to do for myself, especially in some of the seasons that I've experienced recently, is allowing myself to be open and okay and vulnerable enough to be a blank canvas and allow God to paint as God saw fit.
And the thing that just keeps coming up for me is courage, right?
Mm-hmm.
It takes courage to be that vulnerable that you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about, to be open
Mm-hmm.
to God and allowing God to show you the spaces, that need
Yeah.
healing, and then
Yeah.
allowing God to help you heal those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
It takes courage to be honest with yourself that I'm still dealing with this. I'm still struggling with this. Um,
Yeah.
and sometimes it takes courage to ask for help from somebody else,
Mm-hmm.
um, that I can't deal with this by myself. I need
Right.
somebody.
Yeah.
Because that's one of our deepest, darkest, right? There's some things we don't vocalize to others, but I
Mm-hmm.
believe that there's healing in the things, once again, you can confront, you can name, and you can confront. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm
And
hoping that,
also,
mhm,
Dr. Vanderbilt talks about, especially with dealing with trauma, it takes courage to remember.
mm,
And I think too, when dealing with traumatic experiences, a lot of times people think, oh, trauma is just sitting with a therapist and talking about what happened when you were 5 years old, or focusing on that experience, not realizing that a lot of that trauma, it's like digging up, trying to dig a hole in the sand. The deeper you go, the deeper the hole gets. And as you're digging through, you discover so many different things. And I think a lot of people, when it comes to dealing with that imposter syndrome, that self doubt, all those things, that becomes, like you said, it takes courage because you have to be willing and ready to face things as they come up. Those different emotions, those strong, emotions that come up. And some of those answers that you've tried to override and overlook, or some of the truth you've tried to override and overlook, and also being ready and willing to do something with that as it comes up.
Absolutely. Wow, I think this has just been an awesome conversation where we're just scratching the surface, of course, on a topic that is this rich and deep,
Mm-hmm.
and can touch and go in so many different directions. But I think it is a good conversation to have. I
Mm-hmm.
may invite you back so we can have a part 2 at some point,
Well,
and
thank
pick it
you.
up. But I think this was a good place to kind of discuss and lift up, what are the elements connected at this intersection, and, what is that journey toward healing, beyond resilience. I apologize. My throat is doing a
You're
little
fine.
something different today, but it's
Mm-hmm.
okay. We press on, we press forward. Just before we close out, you've got to tell us about Glam Theology and kind of
Yes.
where that came from, the inspiration, where that's going, and anything else exciting that you have coming up.
Yes. So Glam Theology came from I believe I was going into my second year of seminary. And I knew I was definitely being called into ministry. There was no doubt about that. But I knew that there was more, I don't want to say impactful work, but there was authentic work for me to do for the kingdom in the whole theological space. Um, and the more I went into the further I went into my degree, the more I realized that if I'm gonna bring myself to this, I have to bring all of me to it. And so just sitting with God and talking with God, like, how do I do this and be authentic about it? Bringing in that social work aspect, the psychology aspect, the theological aspect, but also wrapping it around, like wrapping glam around it. And so basically I realized that, going deeper into Genesis, sitting reading Genesis, and I'm looking at, the creation narrative and how God created, the universe and all those different things. And when I came on to the Imago Day, that's where it kind of like a light bulb opened for me. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt like there has to be something to be said about adorning oneself. Whether it's doing makeup, doing your hair, taking a shower, brushing your teeth, all of those different things, there's a spiritual aspect to it. And like I said, at first it was, for me, it was just when you look good, you feel good. And
Hmm.
that if we're created in the image of God, that we have to take care of ourselves. But it wasn't until after the recent murder of my brother, that I realized that it's so much deeper than that. And so for me, I took that experience and I just explored different aspects of healing, and how I could use those things that I was, going through, and use myself as an experiment to, whether it was prayer, meditation, being in nature, walking in a garden, trying to explore actually creating my own garden, those different things that I began to explore, and I began to realize that, there is a very significant theological piece to this, to adorning oneself. And so yeah, that's where Glam Theology came from. So basically what Glam Theology does is it pretty much takes adornment and sees it through a very it puts a divine premium on adorning yourself. But it just goes deeper than just, looking pretty. It goes to, the whole mental health aspect of it, taking care of yourself, going to the doctor,
Mm,
sleeping, prayer, different things like that. But also seeing it through a very theological lens. And so that's what glam theology is. Because I realized that the the answer doesn't always have to be through a book, or it doesn't always have to come from a doctor or whatever. Our bodies and our spirits and our soul speaks to those things, and that if we
right.
explore those deeper and work on focusing and healing on those things, then we can get a lot better and do a lot better in life. And so that's what glam theology is.
The scripture passage comes to mind of, let your light so shine, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
don't put it under a bushel, but, make it on top of a hill so that others can see it. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that adornment kind of comes out of that space of, I don't want to hide this. I want to live in the fullness of kind of who I can be in God so that others will see God through me. And even
Yes.
in the adornment, they see God through the adornment.
Yeah, absolutely. Because initially, like I said, for me, it was just when you look good, you feel good. I'm made in the image of God, so I have to take care of myself. But
Hmm.
I learned that healing can truly come from, sitting in the garden. A lot of times, especially after my brother passed, there was a moment where I was sitting on my balcony, and I'm just talking to God, and I'm lamenting, and I'm frustrated, and I'm angry, and I'm upset, and I'm like, God, how could you do this? How could you allow this to happen when you know how much I care about my brother? And I remember sitting and looking at there's very like those tall trees. I think they call it pine trees or something, whatever. But they started to sway back and forth, and
Mm,
a squirrel ran up the tree, and then I looked up and I seen a very big bird's nest. And so for me, it was like, if for these trees to be so tall and to be swaying, and this squirrel to not be worried and run up the tree, and this for this bird, whatever bird it was, to build their nest in these very tall trees that you can see swaying, if they're not worried about it, and if God created something that's been sustaining them for so long, then I know that I can get through this situation.
mm,
And it just helped me to understand that, God is not only is God just the creator of myself, but God is the creator of all things. And so God created this situation, God created this grief. And so for me, I knew that God will also create a moment of joy and peace and transformation for me. And so that's when I started, experiencing or exploring more things like, holistic teas. That's healing my
mhm,
body when I get anxious, or when I get depressed, doing different types of journaling and just very intentional practices that I felt like I was adorning myself, but also allowing God into that space and wrapping that glam around it again. And so that's where glam theology came from. So yeah, really focusing on the body and tending to what the body tells us, because again, like I said, the body keeps the score. And so yeah, that's where my research and my thesis focuses on.
Oh my. Well, you got to tell the people how they can get in contact with you so they can follow up and find out more about glam theology as well as the things that God is doing with you.
Uh, I can be found on Instagram at Glam Theology. I can also be found on TikTok as the Glam Theologian, and I and I can be found on my other Instagram site where I do like a lot of the spiritual stuff or just my own personal stuff. Is it's in honor of my brother, it's Alba J, little sister, so it's at ALBEJ underscore LIL, and then sister, but the E is spelled with three. So those are the spaces that they can connect with me. I do have some more things coming up, so but I'll have that posted on those different places.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending the day with us and having
Sure.
this much needed, meaningful conversation. I thank you for being here, and hopefully, we'll see you back for part two at some point.
Yes. Oh yes, absolutely.
Audience, thank you so much for being here and listening to our podcast today. Stay tuned for season 3, episode 3, that'll be coming up next week. Take care of yourselves and be well.
TheoTherapist Podcast, real talk at the intersection of theology and therapy. Check out Dr. Glenn's new journal series titled Brain Dump Journals for the Busy, available on Amazon. Visit our websites for more information at TheoTherapist.com or CatriceGlenn.com.